Augustine, who was an early church theologian, Augustine said there's two kinds of church. There's a visible church and there's an invisible church. The visible church are those that attend church. They do all the right checkbox. They come to church, they tithe, they serve, they do all the right things, but there's never been a conversion. The invisible church are those remnant within the church that are actually truly saved. Billy Graham says he believes that 50% of the church in America is truly believers. So there is this church, and even if you go to the parable of the tares and the wheat that Jesus talks about, that's an illustration of the church. And at the end of days, he will sift the wheat and from the tares, that there are both believer and non-believer within the church. And now you can understand why you get burned by a church, why there's people that'll burn you in the church. I mean, there are a lot of people within this place that within the universal church that claim to be Christians that aren't in fact Christians. But there is a remnant, and this is what Paul's talking about. There's a remnant, and specifically, this is the same kind of thing he's talking about with Israel, that not all Israel is true Israel. He's trying to make a point that just because you're a nationalistic Jew does not mean you're a true child of God. And so they believe that and to be a Jew meant that your ticket to heaven was punched. If you were born of the right parents, and both your parents were Jewish, you automatically went to heaven. That was the deal. You were nationalistic, you were nationally Jewish, and therefore you were God's child. And so Paul is fighting that. He's pushing back on that. And you can see that truth happen. This is why the Pharisees said to Jesus, they said to him, hey, we are God's children because Abraham is our father. And Jesus looks at him and says, oh yeah, you're descendants of Abraham, but your father is the devil. Don't you love Jesus? He can just say stuff like that and get away with it, right? If I came up here and said, your father's the devil, he'd be like, get him out of there. He's crazy, right? But Jesus can say it, he's Jesus, right? And so he looks at him and says, no. You might be Jewish, but God's not your father. Matter of fact, the antithesis of God, the devil, is your father. Crazy. But anyway, so he's saying that ethnic Israel is not true Israel because election is not nationalistic. It's individual. And that's why he's saying here, not all descendants from Israel belong to Israel. People aren't in just because they are Abraham's offspring. And he says it's not the children of the flesh who belong to Israel, it's the children of the promise. Now, he gives two illustrations. He gives Ishmael and Isaac, and then he's going to give Jacob and Esau. We'll read in a minute. So let's talk about Ishmael and Isaac. Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament, if you remember, Abraham and Sarah, God called Abraham out, and he promised him that he would give him a son that would be the lineage from which the Messiah would come, and he would be a blessing to all nations. And that this offspring would be given to him, and it would be the child of promise, right? Now, Abraham was old. Sarah was old. They were beyond baby-making years, you know what I'm saying, right? And so here they are, and Abraham begins to get frustrated because the promise had come, and he's waiting. Nothing happened. He's only getting older. So finally, he tries to take matters into his own hands, and he sleeps with his Egyptian maid Hagar, and they produce a son, Ishmael. Ishmael was the firstborn of Abraham, but he was not the child of promise. Abraham begged God, let my firstborn be the child of promise. And he said, no, I'm not going to do it. I told you what's going to happen. I told you that Sarah is going to produce a child. And from that child will all the nations be blessed. From that child, I will make you your descendants many, from him. Okay, so about 14 years later, God does what he said he's going to do. He always does what he says he's going to do. So God, through Sarah, miraculously births a child. His name is Isaac. And so Paul is putting out this argument or answering the question with this analogy because he's showing them that salvation comes not because of nationality, right? Ishmael was Abraham's son too. It had nothing to do with being the son of Abraham. It had everything to do with being the one God chose and the one that God wanted it to happen through. It's also an example of salvation doesn't come by our own merit or our own effort, right? You have Ishmael being born by Abraham taking matters into his own hands, his own will, his own effort, his own works. And God says, no, that's not the way I intended it to be. That's not the way it's going to be. The way I intend it is all grace, all me, all miracle, all child of promise. So he's given us another analogy for election, that he does it in his own way. He does it in his own might, in his own power. So he's blessing Isaac because it's the miracle child. It's the one through which the descendants of Abraham would be, and all nations would be blessed, right? The lineage from which Jesus would come from.